Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us today for our Safety and Health webinar sponsored by Avetta. We are going to let our audience settle in for just a minute here before we get started, and we'll start the presentation shortly. Hi, folks. Once again, we'll start the presentation today in just about a minute or so. We're going to let our audience settle in. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast, Moving Beyond Ratings, Launching and Maintaining Sustainable, Resilient Supply Chain Programs, sponsored by Avetta. This is Barry Botino. I'm an associate editor at Safety and Health and a co host of the On the Safe Side podcast. I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before we get started, I want to let you know that the views of today's speaker and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or the magazine endorses those items. At the conclusion of today's event, we'll conduct a Q&A with our speaker. If you have a question, just click the Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your screen. Type in your question and just tap that send button. You can submit those questions at any time during today's event. After this presentation, you'll also be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, but I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. This webcast will be archived. If you'd like to view this presentation or any of our past webcasts, please go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. Now let's introduce our speaker. Joining us today is Katie Martin. Katie serves as the Director of Sustainability at Avetta, and she has spent the last 15 years leading businesses through ESG and sustainability transformations. She has designed, implemented, and assessed ESG and sustainability programs for many different types of companies, from startups all the way to Fortune 500 organizations. Again, we thank you all for tuning in today, and with that, welcome, Katie, and please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Barry. And thank you to our hosts for having me. I'm really excited to speak a bit more about our topic today and really dig into this kind of intersection between health and safety, ESG, and thinking about how to best traverse this kind of tumultuous ecosystem that we find ourselves in from a regulatory perspective. To tee us up for today, just to set expectations, I'm going to move a little quickly through some foundational elements, speaking about materiality and risk and what really underpins the activities that we'll dive into specifically around sustainable supply chain management, including all of the metrics and disclosures and frameworks that are out there until we get to really supply chain and sourcing and thinking about how we intersect with our suppliers and engage with them in a world where they are predominantly the largest contributors to a lot of our ESG factors. And then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. Please feel free to use the Q&A box as we go along to drop in your questions, and I'll try to address them live if feasible, but we'll have some time at the end for that as well. Before we kick off, though, I'd just love to get a sense of who's attending today so I can kind of cater the context and the depth of what I shared to where you all are currently situated from an ESG responsibility and organization maturity standpoint. So our first poll is, what level of responsibility do you have for ESG reporting in your org right now? And if you just pick the one that best aligns with where you are, I know there's a lot of overlap and sometimes blending of roles right now. I feel like a lot of folks in leadership think EHS, ESG, those seem like the same letters. Let's have them be responsible for all of this. But please just feel free to drop where you think you fall right now. All right, looks like we got some answers trickling in. And let's see where we landed on this. Also, it looks like we have a pretty decent spread. Most folks having some kind of contribution role, but not really owning all of the reporting, but still have about 20% in that all of the data flows through me space. And then some people the kind of lighter to none contributing to this process. So that's really helpful. Great. So this is kind of you as an individual and where you sit. Let's talk about your organization now, and just back of the envelope, your assessment of where your organization is positioned right now on the ESG maturity scale, as we like to call it. So anywhere from being a leader where you're pushing beyond compliance and thinking about circular economy and design, and you're part of different frameworks and standards bodies and certs, all the way down to, we're just kind of transversing into this space right now and starting to think about which aspects apply to us and which regulatory components we really need to keep an eye on, and anything in between. So again, just best guess. This is not a graded quiz, but I'll be sure to kind of pull in relevant examples that kind of map to where a lot of you are occupied. So, all right, looks like we got some answers coming in. Let's see where we landed. Okay. Excellent. A little less spaced out here, but a lot of folks kind of in that beginner space to learner, where maybe you have a general sense of expectations from a regulatory perspective, or perhaps your organization has set a net zero by 2040 goal or something in that range. So excellent. All right, it's very helpful. Appreciate everyone. I'm gonna try to waffle through this. A lot of what we'll share today is kind of framework context, where you can go as deep into it as you like as an organization, depending on that maturity level and the resources available. But I'll try to give a lot of really salient examples of that. And I am a representative of Avetta, both as our director of sustainability, so a lot of empathy with everyone on here trying to manage that reporting requirements. But I also play a role in our advisory and our product development side, as we have a supply chain ESG solution. So we're relevant. I'll speak to that just briefly to give you, again, some context, but this is going to be pretty content heavy on kind of framework and process. So I have a tendency to kind of blaze through things because I want to leave enough time for Q&A. But again, as questions arise, please drop them in the box and I'll try to address them live as I can. So the first thing I want to level set on is materiality and risk. And materiality, you may be familiar with both in an ESG context or maybe in a financial context. And some of you may be familiar with SASB, or the artist formerly known as SASB, that's rolled up into Value Reporting Foundation into IFRS as all of these systems start to consolidate. But essentially, this is a resource that when you're looking at your business and thinking about the impactful ESG risks, the things that specifically because of the industry you occupy are going to be most salient, SASB is your resource for identifying those components. And this is what we like to call our sustainability wheel at Avetta, really addressing some of those really top line elements that fall under the sustainability/ESG banner. And this is where I like to joke that like safety leaders and EHS folks were doing ESG before it was cool, because a significant amount of these components are, already, I won't say duplicative, because some of them go a bit deeper or a bit broader. But as we think about the environmental considerations and a lot of the safety pieces, things like psychological and psychosocial safety falling under sustainability concerns. A lot of these things are already in folks' preview. So this is where, somewhat jokingly, leadership may assume that a lot of this just overlays into existing safety professionals' jobs. But as we all know, it is quite extensive and differentiated in some respects, especially when we start talking about GHG and scope 1, 2, and 3 and managing the supplier relationships there. So when you look at this, not all of these will apply to you and your business, and not all of them will apply to your suppliers. And being able to kind of identify which of these components do, both in your own context and your suppliers, is what really helps your sustainability programs achieve that high impact ROI. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is how you can really hyper focus on the key priority areas that have the most impact for your business and help you achieve your goals much more quickly that way. So one thing that is really big in this space, and you'll probably hear a lot if you haven't already, is this idea of double materiality. And now there's even triple materiality, but fear not, it's kind of a little icing on the cake of double materiality. Essentially, the way we used to assess risk and think about those components was at a single materiality level, which was financial impact. And essentially, as we're thinking about like external factors and components having influence on the company, whether it's reputational value, weather and environmental concerns, et cetera. And when we think about double materiality, we now also consider the products or services that you're providing as a business, how do they influence the social and communities that you serve and the environment as well, and the availability of the resources that you require to make those components, the availability and location of the workforce that you require as well for your work, et cetera. And so we like to speak about this in the sustainability field as just thinking about the true cost of your products and services at this time. I think there's a lot of rhetoric sometimes and unease around ESG as being superfluous or unnecessary, or even kind of complicating the financial metrics and the drives that we need to make our businesses stay strong. And what we'll actually come to find is considering ESG and sustainability concerns helps preserve the financial sustainability, pun unintended, of your organization, and even helps with competitive advantage and cost savings. So as we go further through this, hopefully that will become a bit more apparent. But from a data standpoint, we find groups that invest and take sustainability metrics into account, see higher margins, are better able to weather unpredictable events. So for instance, those that had strong sustainability programs were able to reopen after the COVID shutdown much more quickly and pivot their programming. We also see this as a talent attraction and retention event as well. So lots of good positive pieces here. So when you go through a materiality assessment, and this is typically something that it can be done by an outside shop, like a third party. If you think about your McKinsey's and your Bains out there, this is something they frequently help with. But it's essentially looking at the SASB correlated events. So if you go into SASB, SASB.org, and you type in the name of your organization, if you're public, and if you're private, you can look yourself up by industry. It will essentially say, here's a roadmap of the top 3 to 5 to 7 issues that we know have material impact on your organization. And it'll be things like supply chain, transparency, water, energy, and things of that nature. And what a materiality review does is it thinks about those components that have been identified and their financial impact. And then it also looks at what your stakeholders think is most viable and important to your business. And stakeholders in this case could include your C-suite, your investors, your board, your key personas for buying from a B2C kind of context. And it helps you then within that universe of possibilities of impacts and things that you could take into account of your organization around, your social, your environmental, and your governance needs, and helps you kind of segment them in importance of financial impact and your stakeholder impact. And that's how a lot of companies doing kind of materiality matrices, you may have heard, have started to identify those pieces. And this is really important. I know a lot of us are probably thrown into this because somebody in the C-suite or some key investor read something somewhere, and now suddenly ESG and sustainability is important, and we need to have a net zero 2050 goal, and everything is kind of coming a bit more, cart before the horse. So not all of us have the luxury of starting and saying, what is our business? What are our risks? What are we committing to? Okay, and let's then reverse engineer a program into those core pieces. But if you can, or if you can pull up after year one, where you rapidly got the data in some way, shape, or form that was required, but it wasn't a smooth process, we don't think we've covered all of our risk parameters, going back to a materiality review is really key. And it is something that as we progress in this space, materiality matrices, or matrices as it were, get a little bit of criticism because they are kind of static documents. And as the regulatory environment is so rapidly evolving here, and as core to materiality, the location and the project have a lot of impact. So you may have a flat materiality map for your business, but if you're operating in Sierra Leone, your risks are going to look a little different than the business operating out of London. So a lot of times the requirements to kind of pivot and shift and keep regional compliance concerns in mind are really critical. And if you don't have a dedicated sustainability professional headcount at your organization, it can be a little challenging to keep ahead of. So what we're going to talk about is how you can kind of take this materiality process and apply it to your supply chain and your suppliers. That helps give a little more consistency and doesn't require as much adaptation. But a lot of times this is a great starting point for businesses to really align on what's important to us as a company, what reflects our current culture, where do we want to go, and what's important externally to our key stakeholders. So why is all this kind of falling through the organization makeup and landing mostly on health and safety and procurement folks? And the reason for that is a significant amount of the contributors to your ESG metrics, especially when we think about environment, are going to come from your supply chain. And depending on the industry you're in, it could be almost 100%. So really thinking about how you manage your suppliers, what kind of visibility and baseline data you have with them, and how you're working with those that are maybe not performing at a level that you're going to need them to be at in order to meet your own, carbon goals or social goals is really critical. And we have a bit of a window here if you're based in North America, especially in the US, where our ESG legislation is a little lagging, but there are significant indicators that in the next 24 months, we're going to be kind of ushering folks to be on par with our European compatriots who are a bit more advanced in terms of ESG data reporting expectations and performance. And with the SEC release, while they kind of paused the idea of reporting on a certain level of your carbon output, we're essentially starting with at least taking stock of your own carbon output as an organization and in kind of a precursor to be able to start reporting to the supply chains you participate in as well. So really critical to start laying the groundwork for these programs now and getting this kind of reporting expectation and process in place before it suddenly becomes immediately urgent because of rapid legislation passing. So let's talk about a lot of the organizations and kind of frameworks driving this conversation, and some of which that you're likely kind of beholden to. Either you've self-selected or you fall under their purview and are trying to kind of meet their reporting requirements. I pulled out some of the big ones, but I think, as we all know, it's a very complex and a little congested of an environment right now in terms of who watches the watchmen, so to speak. We are seeing a lot of consolidation, as I mentioned, SASB kind of rolling up in a lot of organizations coming together under the IFRS. But these are still some of the big players, especially if you're concerned or have any kind of environmental concerns. CDP is really huge right now, and SBTI as well. GRI, GRESB, and SASB are more generalist in terms of covering that whole sustainability wheel instead of focusing on the environment. I'm not going to read through all this right now, so fear not, but you'll have that available as in the presentation as you move forward. It can help you determine which of these frameworks makes the most sense for your industry and business to report into. Some of these you may not have a choice if you're, your main investors or whatnot are looking for SBTI goals and et cetera. But one thing that could help you navigate this is there's a wonderful tool on the World Economic Forum's website called their ESG ecosystem map. I've linked it here so you have access to that after the presentation. But it essentially lays out all of these bodies and stakeholders according to the quadrant they occupy. So whether they're kind of in the investor coalition or they're like data providers or they're standard setters. And when you double click in, you can get into the specific aspects of those reporters and even double click even more so into the specific group itself and understand what they're going to ask of you, what their reporting cycle is, et cetera. So if you haven't selected a reporting framework yet, and you're kind of in this space where you need to explore the ecosystem to better understand which apply to your organization, this is a great place to start. Or if you're just curious to, a new acronym has come across your desk or in your email, so to speak, and you need to better understand that. So I'll pop in a couple other resources as we go along as well. But let's get into kind of the meat of our conversation today. And I'll preface this with, unfortunately, I can't just hand you kind of a here's how to do it booklet, because as we mentioned, materiality has such a contextual impact that there is no one size fits all. To some extent, that is great for your organization because you can really build a solution and a program that's fit to purpose and identifies your specific risks. In others, it's a little challenging because there's going to be a lot of nuance. This is not necessarily going to be the same year to year until some of these regulations settles. So this is kind of like, the advent of like Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank. We haven't really had kind of the one piece of legislature regulation that sets the standard, and all data expectations look like this, reporting cycle looks like this. So there still is a high degree of variability based on where you're situated geographically, if your supply chain is global, and even if you're in a specific industry, and you're looking to address those concerns really directly for certain stakeholders. Um, that's another piece where you can get started as well, is there's typically these more global oversight boards like GRI that we discussed, but let's say you're in the IT sector. There's a group called TCO that specifically does ESG oversight for the IT sector. Its standards are mapped to the material risks for IT. And so if you're in this space and looking for a certification or for a review that really maps to the type of classification of work you do, really critical. So investing a little time researching the ESG certification bodies aligned with your industry can be really helpful, and also can help you skip a few steps because they've already done the materiality mapping. And as long as you're following their framework and answering the questions that they're requiring of you, you can rest assured that you are addressing the material risk for your specific industry. So that can be a little way to skip a few steps and make sure that you have the coverage that you need. But let's talk about getting into it from a supply chain perspective, since as we addressed earlier, this is going to be the most critical element of your business from an ESG perspective that has the highest impact on all of those metrics, regardless of industry. So what we'll start with is at the bottom. So getting those sustainability goals, alignment from your organization and operationalizing them internally and having the governance in place to do so. Then how we can create supply chain transparency, start to get that baseline data from our suppliers, understand where we currently live, what good looks like, and how we can get to that space for us as an organization. And then getting to reporting. We've done all this great work. How do we make sure that internally and externally that we're conveying our current status and addressing any concerns that folks may have? And then thinking about how we can utilize this to drive sustainable partnerships, get those economies of scale, and think about the carbon transition needs or the product transition needs that may be before us as we think to decarbonize. Okay, so operationalizing sustainability goals. Again, this is one of those things that is a little bit of a luxury, but it's something that you kind of have to integrate into all the plates that you're spinning as well in order to have a really successful program. And again, you'll start to see where you can sketch out kind of the bare minimum requirements if we were just trying to be in a compliance space, which may be where we need to start and get some internal business buy-in before we get the investments in people, process, or tools required to go a bit deeper and a bit more ahead of the curve. But it really starts with defining what your sustainability goals are and what's required in your organization to achieve them. And that's some of the materiality components that we talked about. But it's thinking about if we are setting a net zero goal, if we do have concerns about forced labor, what within our organization do we need to map to in order to suss out those data points? A lot of that, of course, is going to come from supplier interaction and surveying, but there also are elements within your organization that need to be in place. If you have a regional or global kind of procurement management board, is someone from your sustainability team represented on that board? Or is there some kind of cross-functional communication, since we know procurement and health and safety are going to be big triggers here? How are we set up to report these components out? Is some of our ESG and data reporting pieces integrated into our C-suite quarterly business reviews? Is it managed? Is it tracked? Is there visibility? I think, Peter Drucker said, what does it matter? I'm going to totally butcher this, forgive me, y'all. But essentially, if you're not tracking it, then you're not able to manage it and it doesn't matter to your business. So we need to think about how are we integrating it into existing processes to get that visibility, or think about incentivization measures. If these are going to be new data requirements and goals set on your health and safety folks and your procurement folks, and they have a certain compensation makeup, how do we integrate that into that compensation makeup so that not only are they incentivized, but there isn't any kind of competition and trade-off for them in meeting these goals versus meeting some of our more, we call them traditional goals. And so some of the steps and checks that you can do for this are really thinking about your existing kind of risk makeup and risk process. and thinking about how to pull those factors in, both at your kind of departmental level, but also more vertically throughout the organization too. Thinking about the information management systems that you have. So right now we probably have a slew of technical tools and dashboards and sites that are kind of strung together with just magic tape and hopes to try to get data across the organization and manage each different departmental need. So thinking about your existing systems and similar to how we thought about what needs to change operationally with our people management and reporting, where does this data live right now? When you're thinking about the frameworks that you have to report to, they ask you for this, this, and this. So where does that data live in your organization? Do you have access to it? Is it a system that doesn't exist yet and we need to set it up? Is it something where we need to consolidate? So doing that to start can help you really get an edge on identifying where your technical needs are. It's one of the reasons I think a lot of folks enjoy working with Avetta because we have an umbrella banner where health and safety, our sustainability, our technical and IT risk, and our adverse media monitoring, all of that lives in one space, which could be a little more helpful in this emerging place. But you can kind of bolt together that system internally as well. Again, a little more difficult if you don't have a dedicated headcount to manage that, but something that you can kind of sit down and prepare for well in advance of a reporting cycle so you're not scrambling. And then again, we talked again about materiality, but figuring out which major metrics are the most important internally and externally to start. Perhaps you can't complete an exhaustive questionnaire right now with GRI, but you can get these 4 data points about the state of your supply chain and your GHG output. And that's year 1. And I find that a lot of folks are really accepting of that. We understand it's a process, both as reporters and reportees, as I sit on a couple of boards that review this data. And I think the biggest thing is pushing as hard as you can to extract as much data as possible to start and identifying and telling the story about why you don't have the rest of the data and how you're going to get to it. And just being transparent in that space can be very helpful. But one reason you do want to sit a little longer in this space, if you can, this stage rather, is because things shift so quickly. A lot of times your numbers may shift quickly too. So for instance, if you set a net zero 2030 goal and you had this baseline, but actually 2 years later, you realized you weren't mapping 30% of the supply chain that you needed to have more accurate numbers. Now suddenly you have a narrative you need to put together about why your numbers jumped so much from year 2 to year 3. We were looking like this and now we're back up here. So again, encouraging you and hopefully arming you for any senior stakeholders that you have to really make the case for taking a little initial time before you jump in so that you have your priorities in order, you understand your data needs, and you can get an accurate baseline and set realistic goals for yourself. So I dropped this in because I thought this was an interesting piece in terms of thinking about the stages of a sustainable supply chain and procurement processes. And this is, again, kind of doubling down on what specific actions and activities within kind of the procurement process, which is where a lot of our supplier intake obviously happens and where we can start to proactively manage a lot of ESG concerns. And you'll see here the leaves kind of indicate the impact level of some of these pieces, but managing your suppliers and thinking about source to contract integrations for your ESG concerns is a really great start. For instance, an example, we have some of our partners who spent year 1 and year 2 just collecting a significant amount of data from their suppliers to understand across ES and G concerns where they kind of fell. And now they're able to say, all right, by 2027, if you want to be a supplier with us, your GHG performance must look like this. You must have this kind of policy. You must be, implementing these type of programs. And it gives their suppliers a chance to make the operational changes to still be competitive with that business, by the time their actual procurement concerns change. Or we have one now that takes ESG concerns. If you have a modern day slavery program and policy, same for GHG, et cetera. And it's kind of a non-financial weighted metric as part of their RFP process or part of their programmatic review at the end of an engagement. So there's ways to start to integrate this in to incentivize suppliers to move it up the ESG maturity ladder and to help mitigate the risk that you're bringing into your business from an ESG perspective. One thing I like to put up as well is this is becoming a little more focused upon in the sustainability sector is psychological and psychosocial safety. So GHG, scope 1, 2, and 3 have been really big drivers for a lot of the ESG legislation. And what we're finding, unfortunately, coming out of the pandemic is a little bit of a labor snapback where we're seeing increasing risks around forced labor and child labor. And not just in the regions that we had typically mapped out as high risk for that, but we're seeing a 3 to 4x rise in the US and similar in Canada. And it's inspiring a lot of new legislation around mitigating kind of modern day slavery, but also even pushing more into psychological and psychosocial risks from the health and safety side. And this is essentially like, are we creating environments that recognize the diversity of our workplace and provide channels for them to give feedback or raise alarms or ask questions that map to their preferences. And I think something that's really interesting is I think this is the first time we've had 5 different generations within working age kind of coexisting and co-working. And as we think about the differences in the way a Gen Xer prefers to communicate and their comfort level with different tools and technologies versus Gen Z, we see a lot of significant difference. We're also seeing a difference in from a language perspective. We had someone who had built out training and it was in English and in Spanish since they had a significant Spanish speaking population in their workforce. The English training was about 1 hour and 55 minutes, and the Spanish training was a little over an hour. And so as you think about some things are going to be different when you translate them, but missing almost an hour of content is likely a strong indicator that that group is not receiving the same vigorous training and are going to be posing risks to themselves and to their colleagues because we haven't taken the time to really go through these components. So this is where thinking about kind of the S aspect and even under the DEI banner and recognizing the differentiation with our workforce can be really critical and play a key role in not only your sustainability reporting and metrics, but also your health and safety components. Okay, so moving to the second part, we're thinking about creating supply chain transparency. And so this is where the rubber hits the road. We've hopefully done some great work in identifying which particular components are really critical to our business under the ESG banner. We've started to get some alignment internally with our organizations on who's going to manage this process and how we're going to manage it from a systems component. And now we actually need to engage with suppliers around these pieces. But how do we think about which suppliers need this engagement and what we need to ask them? So this is something where, again, I think companies like Avetta and others play a strong role in accelerating this process and kind of automating it for you. But I'll talk about if you wanted to go through it manually or kind of see the man behind the curtain. And this is where we're kind of thinking about the materiality process that we mapped, but more drilled down from a supplier level now. So you can start to understand your hotspots in a sense. As an organization, those have kind of been identified for you from your materiality mapping or maybe from existing risk matrices that you're already well aware of based on industry or geography. But thinking about which suppliers now have a bit of an expanded risk. I think typically when we see risk modeling, it's based on spend, if there's on-site work, certs, insurance are required, et cetera. And there's a lot of overlap with those suppliers from a health and safety risk perspective and being high risk for sustainability. But there's this hidden, usually about 30 to 35% of your supply chain that may be lower spend, they don't do on-site work, or they don't raise the typical safety flags, but they are extremely risky for you from an ESG perspective. They are condensed contributors to your carbon, or they're a lot of refrigerants, or they're actually occupying a space that's really high risk for forced labor and child labor now. And when we think about our T1 connections, those suppliers we're directly connected to, unfortunately, what happens with ESG is that risk is typically in your tier 2 and tier 3. So you've contracted with these folks, but they're subcontracting out and subcontracting out. And that's where you have less visibility and also where most of the risk lies. And unfortunately, sometimes your T1s understand how to play the compliance game to an extent. And they can sometimes obfuscate your visibility into these additional risks. So what we allow at Avetta and also through this process that you're going to have to go through when you're doing your ESG reporting is to kind of try to bust into that through that wall and better understand these risks. And it's really interesting to see this happening, because I think it's finally like really better understanding our supply chain global ecosystem. To give you an example, I think Hewlett Packard is doing something where they've started a tracking process with direct engagement with their first tier suppliers. And so through kind of a supplier training and education program, they're building the rapport with their suppliers, explaining to them these ESG data reporting requirements, how to access that in their own org. But what they've also started to do is ask them to pull this information from their own subs as well. And start to create policies and governance that if they have a strong modern day slavery program for their own organization, does it also apply to their subs? What kind of due diligence do they do to push through? Now, naturally, it's that your ability to do that is going to vary based on the purchasing power that you have, the regional requirements. We're in a space right now where a lot of this is voluntary for suppliers. So something we try to keep in mind is limiting that supplier reporting burden as much as possible to increase their likelihood to respond. So what we were really talking about here is the same way we said, these are our critical risk ESG elements for us as a business. You're able to then overlay onto your suppliers. So you're only engaging them around the riskiest components available to them, and hopefully pushing into that tier 2 and tier 3 spot where able. But one of the ways you can do that is, again, working with organizations that can automate this for you, or building your own internal policies and process. So I pulled out an example of, we have like an ESG rapid risk model, but a lot of organizations can build this internally as well. And this is an example of forced labor under the S. And so you want to think about, as you have your whole supplier list based on geography, industry, the labor laws of their operational geography, their subcontracting processes, their political stability, et cetera. All of those are going to be factors that contribute to your forced labor risk. And you want to go through and think about which one of these which one of our suppliers are these most applicable to and are creating like a high or a very high risk versus medium and low for these components. And we want to do that across the ES and the G. And again, this could be a bit of a daunting task if you don't have dedicated headcount internally. This is where getting third-party support, either through like a consulting engagement or through a group like Avetta, could be really helpful. And some tools can even start to automate this for you, where you can kind of provide your supplier list. We put it through the sustainability evaluation tool, and it kind of gives you back your list of suppliers based on their ESG risk. And what it typically looks like is you end up with something like this, either by category of suppliers, so the type of services they're providing, all the way down to the supplier level. Where are the risks that they're bringing to your organization based on the work that they do, and their historical reporting, et cetera. And being able to kind of target this way means when we engage with suppliers in category 1, we really put forth ESG questions that do due diligence around child labor, forced labor, sexual harassment, et cetera. But when we're thinking about the category 3 suppliers, we only need to think about their pandemic risks, their climate risks, and their water risks, et cetera. And so being able to kind of customize your engagement with suppliers is really critical, because this way they're not just getting an influx of 200 questions where maybe 11 apply to them, but you're really targeting them based on the work that they do for you. And it's more likely that they're going to have the data available to answer. So again, as you think about your supply chain lists, and we're into thousands of complex, maybe global suppliers, doing this one by one or even at a category level may not be feasible for you internally as an organization. But what you could start to do is through your SASB mapping, so that materiality mapping, through third-party partnerships, or through working with organizations like Avetta and others, kind of rapidly assess this and be able to, at least from a category perspective, say, this group of suppliers brings this environmental risk of these types and these social risks. This is how we're going to engage with them. This group of supplier brings this risk. This is how we're going to engage with them. And what this allows you to do, again, is be really variable, flexible, increase the likelihood a supplier is going to respond, and help you get more of the data that you need to engage around this key issues and set realistic baselines and targets. And again, at this point, a lot of health and safety tools offer this type of support to some extent. So you don't have to recreate the wheel or think about doing this internally, but you probably do want to set a course for thinking about contracting with a vendor who can do this for you, at least once as you kind of set yourself up for supply chain engagement. And I just put a quick example of how we do this and view this on our side of the fence at Avetta and some of the kind of pieces you may want to take into account. So obviously we have, like, as a business, the requirements that we're trying to put forth onto our suppliers, whether that be from health and safety all the way through to sustainability. And then we want to think about the specific supplier attributes that impact and influence their level of risk across all those factors, things we've talked about, like geographic location, classification. And then we want to think about all the standards bodies that apply to us. So who are we beholden to from a data management standpoint? And then from there, filter the supplier experience accordingly. And you can see why I think in year 1 and year 2, we've seen some folks try to manage this internally, either through a lot of Excel spreadsheets or through their supply chain relationship management forum. And it just can get really daunting and overwhelming. And it can be really challenging then to keep up with the supplier response rate. So this is where, again, looking at third-party support could be really helpful and, quite frankly, almost a requirement moving forward as some of these things become less voluntary reporting and more mandatory as well. All right, so we've gone through this process where we've kind of set up our mission and vision on the sustainability side. We've started to gather data from our suppliers, asking them things like, do they have a GHG policy? How are they decarbonizing? Do they have a forced labor policy? How are they de-risking? And we're starting to get all of this information in, maybe even getting some scope 1, 2, and 3 data across our GHG. And for those less familiar with GHG reporting, basically scope 1 and 2 data is the carbon emissions that your business puts out as part of doing business and making your product and service. And scope 3 is your supply chain. The folks that you purchase goods and services from, what are they putting out as part of contributing to your business? And that's where things get a little hinky, because there's a lot of stress to get this data. A lot of our reporting bodies require it, but of course, it requires us to pull that from the suppliers and move them along. So now we're talking about reporting on this data too. And I think this is kind of the crux of a lot of the activities that get started in an organization is we need to have a sustainability report, or we have to start reporting on GHG, or we need to have this goal. And it kind of starts externally facing, and we're building back into how we can get to that point. So the good news is, if you're putting all this work into your programming and gathering all this data, you can really make it work for you in a lot of ways. Again, because your contribution to the environmental risk or social risk, another organization will be absorbing by working with you. If you're well positioned and well marketed in the space, it can be a strong competitive advantage, where, similar to if you have a great health and safety rating, and I can just make certain assumptions that by working with you, you have this coverage, we understand these certs. Sustainability now is becoming similar, where if you have an SBTI rating, or if you have these current policies in place, I can bring you into my organization and know that we have this risk protection and that you're not going to significantly contribute to our own GHG footprint. So this is, I won't say the fun part, but the part where you get to tell your story. A lot of times what we're starting to see too is a consolidation of reporting. So especially in the utility sector, folks are kind of mushing their health and safety and their sustainability data and reports together. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. But because so many of these factors overlap, we're getting into a lot of like hybrid reporting as well, which could be really interesting. But essentially, you've set your goals, you may have made them external, and now we're just reporting on our progress against those sustainability goals, our decarbonization efforts, our supplier training efforts, our employee safety efforts. Where do we want to be? How far along are we? And what are we doing to address the delta? This is also a really great time to foster kind of internal rapport as well with a lot of your employees. Telling their stories, how are they contributing to your safety and sustainability vision? Put a face to the numbers. I won't go too far into this because I think some of it's a little self-explanatory, But again, this is where you can really showcase the data that you have, identify what you don't, and then think about how we're gonna, message the story of how we get there. And this is an example, again, of a merged sustainability and safety report. So we have kind of a coverage in terms of how the organization and its programs impacts the communities that they serve in, local buying programs, and employment numbers, also health and safety pieces and SIF and TIF data, and then a little bit around their carbon reporting as well. And again, depending on your organization, its industry, your ESG maturity, you may be at a space where it makes sense to do a consolidated report. For some, having it separate still makes sense as well. But I always think it's interesting to see these things in real life and come together and start to think about, okay, how would I, bring this to life for my own organization as well? Okay, last but not least, working our way up that ESG maturity ladder now and thinking about how do we drive sustainable partnerships. So the biggest piece and impact that you're going to have on your sustainability data points, again, is your suppliers. So once we have some transparency into their performance level and their risk level, we're going to see, we have some high performers, we have some middling, and we have some high risk folks. And what we need to do is develop engagement with them at their different levels in order to bring them into the compliance level that we desire, especially if they're already big spend suppliers with us, or they're ones we're heavily dependent on. Decoupling is not an issue, or we just want to be able to prepare them for the eventuality that our procurement and health and safety processes are going to have these expectations. So setting this kind of expectation early is really great with suppliers. What we're actually finding, especially for kind of SMBs and mid-market, having their contractors message them with this, give them education and materials, let them know what's expected of them is actually quite welcome. Of course, anytime you ask for additional data, there's going to be a little bit of grumbling as people see that as an impetus between them and, their goals. But what we're actually coming to find is a lot of folks are adjusting to this quite quickly. Again, the system that you utilize to engage with your suppliers and make sure that they're only receiving the questions most relevant to them is going to be really critical, and helping them be able to address your needs. Because just as you are probably struggling to get resourcing and headcount in the sustainability side, as we think about a lot of our smaller suppliers, mostly just trying to keep the lights on, they definitely don't have a dedicated sustainability professional who can fill out 150 questions for you. So we really want to meet them where they are, help identify where they can improve, and hopefully start providing some training or resources for them to do so. At Avetta, we do that directly through webinars, trainings, and a lot of documentation and sustainability playbooks we put together. But there's a lot of additional resources out there. The Responsible Business Alliance could be one that's helpful for you both as an organization and as for your suppliers. But going through this checklist, thinking about lessons learned and how to integrate it back into the system and your processes as you go into year 2 of supplier data and year 3 is going to be really critical. So apologies, I know I'm going a little over time, but we're our last slide here before we get to some of our Q&A. You may remember at the beginning, we asked you to kind of stack rank yourself, somewhat similarly aligned to these kind of 4 phases. But what you'll find is when you come out of either year 1 or year 2 of data collection from your suppliers, they're going to start falling into similar phasing. And you want to think about your relationship management and content management process with them. So, maybe your trendsetters are, transforming into one-page case studies, or they're hosting a co-presented webinar or email with you, or something of that nature, showcasing how they got from A to Z as a business and how they would recommend other suppliers do so. When we think about decarbonization efforts, the dirty little secret is a significant amount of decarbonizing is just efficiencies. It's thinking about route optimization, fleet mix, fuel mix, paper versus digital processes, less waste, both in terms of water, energy, and product, circularity, et cetera. A lot of these things are really teachable and trainable to suppliers as well, and allow them to kind of pull some quick short-term levers to start to make those improvements in processes. Sometimes it's as easy as getting some governance in place and a policy while they make the longer term changes that are necessary. And this is where we start to get into things like you may have heard of carbon offsets. So the idea that you have a GHG number that looks like this, and you can buy an offset, like an investment in a Brazilian tree farm or in a plankton group that covers that carbon for you and brings you to zero. And so you're kind of netting out in a sense. But what's happening is that's driving a lot of ire, I'll say, in the consumer market, where folks just see this as a pay to play type of investment rather than making the organizational changes that permanently reduce your carbon as low as possible before doing offsets. And so that internal work that we want to do both for ourselves and our supplier is called carbon insetting, where we're making the adjustments in materials, in sourcing, in process, in production that have a permanent effect and reduce our carbon as much as possible. So we try to drive that through all of the 4 steps here, and we think about that from the social side as well, so that we can move our suppliers up that ladder and move alongside them and accordingly. So a lot of thought into what does your current supplier relationship management program look like? What kind of content do you have? Is there ability to create kind of a quick 1-page supplier resource page on your website for ESG and sustainability issues that maybe it even just directs them to other sites that are relevant to them, but can start them to understand this process and better participate in your organization and in your data requests. So Barry, I'm terribly sorry. I did say this might happen, and unfortunately it did. We went a little over, but I think we could pull up here and see if we have any questions incoming, or if folks want to start dropping some as well into Q&A, we'll start making our way through.
That sounds great, Katie. Thank you so much. We'll give Katie a quick breather here. Just a reminder for our audience, if you do have a question, click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type in your question and press the send button. We're going to try to get to as many of your questions as we can in the time that we have here. Before we start the Q&A, I want to let everyone know about the evaluation survey that we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this webinar. Your input is really important to us because it does help us to improve our future webcasts. And Katie, where I actually wanted to start with you during the Q&A here is I would be remiss if I didn't say that you will be presenting at Congress and Expo in Orlando for NSC Tuesday, September 17th. Your presentation is called Leaning In and Listening to the ESG Conversation, What to Know Within the Intersections of Harmony of HSE and ESG, with your Avetta colleague, Scott DeBow. And I wanted to ask what kind of takeaways you would hope that folks would take from your presentation at Congress next month.
Yeah, really looking forward to that. I kind of actually see our conversation today as a bit of a precursor to that, where we're kind of setting the stage here and starting to talk a little bit about the intersection of ESG and EHS. When Scott and I speak at Congress, we're going to go a little deeper into that intersection and better talk about, all right, these are the data requirements that are somewhat overlapping between safety and sustainability. How do we acquire this data? How do we source it? How do we report it? And how do we create policies that are proactive in helping keep a safe and sustainable workplace? So I guess I'll say it'll be a little bit like chapter 2 of our conversation today, and really practically applying some of these components and getting some good examples of how that's been effectively executed in the wild by some companies as well.
Excellent. Well, for folks who want to know more, you can go to congress.nsc.org. And Katie and Scott's session is session number 88 on Tuesday, September 17th. Katie, I wanted to ask, you had mentioned, talked a little bit about the maturity ladder. And could you share what are some steps or concepts that organizations can follow to build their ESG maturity? For example, if somebody wants to move from, during the poll question you mentioned, from learner to contender, or from contender to leader, what are some steps that they can take to move up that ladder?
It's a great question. We have some kind of checklists and playbooks for this as well. But typically what we see kind of at the lower end is less of an understanding of the ESG environment your organization occupies from a materiality standpoint, and therefore few policies and governance components. So as we start to think about moving up, when we get to like level 2, we'd want to see some of those baseline governance pieces, like having a GHG policy and program, having a modern day slavery policy and program, starting to do a little bit of due diligence with your suppliers, or at least starting to identify them as based on your regional requirements. When we get to level 3, we want to be pushing a little more proactively. So we're not kind of responding to legislation, but rather we have a strong sense of these are the critical aspects for our business from a risk perspective. Here's how, based on our rigorous experience, consulting, advice, best practices, and externally, we've identified to de-risk within our own business and the data we're gathering from suppliers. And here's how we're starting to think about integrating that into some of our supplier assurance processes and how we evaluate them. And when we
Okay,
push
thank.
it to level 4, that's where we start to get more really recently, like Lego, for instance, undertook a huge R&D exercise for a year with a couple of their key suppliers where they allowed them to experiment with the replacement materials instead of the plastic that they utilized, the PFAS, which is an outlier of petroleum refinement. So they allowed their suppliers to source different materials, explore, see if they still met the same product requirements and cost implications in a way to like start to reduce their GHG component. And unfortunately, after year 1, they found right now we're not really able to identify that material, but what we can do is start doing a toy buyback replacement program, get some circularity going, get some education to our consumers. So when you're at level 4, you're kind of, whether it's an R&D or other kind of coalitions, I'm starting to really explore those types of process or product changes that would have industry level impact as well. It can start driving some of this in-setting decarbonization efforts.
Great, thank you for that. Given the complexity of global regulations and how quickly things change year to year in ESG monitoring, how does a company get started identifying which suppliers need to undergo that ESG due diligence?
Yeah, I have to say, if you need to move really quickly and you don't have time or capital to invest in doing kind of that material mapping for suppliers, you can just use your top spend um, risk matrices to start, because they're likely going to have significant overlap with your sustainable risk folks too. So anyone who's kind of going through a health and safety examination with you and due diligence process, you'll want to kind of tack on, so to speak, ESG and sustainability questions as well to start. And I'll be the first to say this can be a really frustrating spot to occupy because things are changing really quickly. These people want this information, these people want this information, these people want this information, and it's really exhausting or challenging to kind of bop around, which is why if you can kind of set your own parameters and say, we're collecting all of this, so no matter who needs what, we can slice and dice, it's really helpful. But if you're kind of chasing the compliance fires, as it were, which sometimes is our reality, I think going with your highest spend is likely going to have a significant overlap with your highest contributors. And a lot of frameworks accept that right now, as long as you have a plan to expand that data chain over time.
Great, thank you for that. I wanted to ask for smaller companies who may be, perhaps a little intimidated by taking on ESG. What are some first steps, and how can they expand their knowledge, and when they jump into the ESG pool, so to speak?
That's a great one. And I think as we think about our global supply chains, a significant amount, I won't put a percentage on it because I know I'm going to be wrong, but upwards of over 60-70% are going to be mid-market at best, mostly SMBs. So what we want to do there is like acknowledge both from a supplier perspective and then also as an organization, like we're asking of ourselves, what really is feasible. And a lot of times, again, I know I've kind of beat this drum a little bit, but SASB.org is a great starting place because it'll hone in right on exactly what's important to your organization. They give you fact sheets and checklists specifically for those components where they define it. They talk about the data you're going to require. And it could be a great way to just have a quick checklist of things that are going to be most impactful for your organization to start, and things you can start to focus on and examine and see if you already have policies, if you already have data coverage, and make sure that you kind of have that minimal sustainability protection. So I would start there. They have amazing resources, lots of webinars, lots of free access and training. And I think, if you dedicate 60 minutes of your time to that website, you'll get a really good foundational understanding of the sustainability requirements of your org and hopefully a general sense of how to go about tackling them as well.
Excellent, thank you. Looks like we have time for one more question, Katie. I want to ask, since much of ESG data reporting and management is still primarily voluntary, how do we walk the fine line with our suppliers, especially top spend?
Yes. Always the eternal question. I think one, taking time to ensure that the questions you're putting before them are absolutely critical. There is this push to get, 50 questions answered and all these data points, but maybe only 3 to 6 are really important right now, and we can build to that. So how do we respect suppliers' time and engage with them in a way that allows them to feel like they're winning as well? If someone is sending out exhaustive surveys, immediately, suppliers may check out from that experience. If one of your key buyers sends you 4 to 6 questions that say, this is why we need this data, you may have a different response. I think the other thing too is communication and messaging. So hopefully in advance of, engaging with suppliers and asking for this information, you're able to either send out some kind of email communication or even host like a supplier webinar or Q&A, something that lets them know this is what we're going to be asking of you. Here's why and how it impacts the business. And here's why it's going to be helpful for you to report this to us. It allows us to prioritize you for X. It allows us to give special pricing considerations, et cetera, et cetera. So how are we kind of incentivizing suppliers and letting them know that we're moving into this position as a business in a way that's as least burdensome to them as possible? But I'll say the good news, bad news is regulations are fast on the heels. So this is kind of becoming a business standard and expectation. Even in the US with the California supply chain transparency laws, if you're connected to a business in California in any way, shape, or form, no matter what state you're in, these are going to start to be reporting requirements over time. So it's good to get ahead of it now. And that could be something that you position to your suppliers too, as helping support their competitive advantage.
Great. Well, thank you, Katie, for all your awesome insights today. Folks, unfortunately, we've run out of time. We thank you all for attending this presentation. We'd appreciate you taking just a minute or two to share your feedback via our survey. A big thank you goes out today to our outstanding presenter, Katie Martin, and of course, everyone from our sponsor at Avetta. This ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. Take care, everyone, and have a safe day.